The South African Jewish Board of Deputies is the organization that engages with the South African government on behalf of the Jewish community. Join Charisse Zeffert for the next hour to find out what the SAJBD has been up to. 101.9 High FM.
Welcome to Jewish Board Talk. This is Adam Charnas. Today I'm joined by Farber Cohen, as Charisse is in Guakani and as has become the minhag. Gabi and I take over the show when Charisse is out of town. First about the archives at the board, and later on we're going to speak a little bit about anti-Zionism and Zionism in the religious context. So we're joined today by David Sachs, who has administered the archives for many, many years, just to discuss the archives and our renovation of the archives and what are the archives. So David, what are the archives? What are their history? Why do we have an archives at the board?
It sort of tells us the story of the Board of Deputies itself, because over time, the board's been around for over 120 years, and what started as just quite a modest voice of the Jewish community on certain issues just expanded into a great big cultural and educational and historical heritage vehicle for the community, in addition to all of the human rights, civil rights work that it did. And so there wasn't a plan to build the archives, but just as stuff accumulated, I think from the late 1940s, one of the main things that happened was that there was an organization called the Jewish Historical and Sociological Society, which went around interviewing sort of pioneers of Johannesburg, pioneers of South Africa, people who arrived in the 1880s and so on, and were still alive. And all of their stuff that they compiled sort of was handed over to the board, and that sort of became the nucleus of the board's archives. But they were collecting a lot of documentation anyway, especially press cuttings, and they were monitoring the media, cutting out the press, and so this just grew from there.
And today we still have a full-time archivist, Eric Matobo, who is actually supposed to join us today, but unfortunately he's not feeling well, so we wish him a speedy recovery. But Eric actually works daily in the archives, and if you can explain a little bit about what he does and how the archives continue to sort of breathe and exist.
Yeah, look, they fulfill a dual purpose. It's an internal archive for the board itself, for our own work, and for other organizations in the Yachad building, because we have a lot of their material. But then it's also obviously open for members of the public, which would include researchers and academics and journalists and genealogists, and very often just people looking for information on their families and so on. And so we get inquiries from all over the world, as well as all over South Africa and internationally as well. But there's certain subjects of particular interest. The South African Jewish response to the Holocaust, for example. South African Jews under apartheid, the country communities, South African country communities, is a subject of enormous fascination for people.
Sure.
And so these are some of the topics that it's a very extensive archive. We've got the records of many defunct congregations and shuls and so on, the minute books and so on, and things like that.
Yeah, I particularly find that quite fascinating.
This is Jewish Board Talk with Charisse Zeffert, only on 101.9 High FM.
Welcome back to Jewish Board Talk. I'm Adam Charnas here with Gabi Farber Cohen, who's actually yet to speak. So Gabi, we've uncovered some incredible artifacts. What's been your favorite find?
One of my favorite finds was when I was looking, the archives had something. We had the Jewish community in South Africa used to have 4 different publications, like 4 Jewish reports, and one of them was called The Zionist. And part of the archives is that every time there's been a publication about Jews, including all the Jewish reports in general media, they archive it. And I went to go look for the newspaper of this South African Jewish publication called The Zionist for 1948, when the State of Israel was established. And what they did is they sent a reporter to Israel for the establishment of the state, and she does an interview with Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion tells her that I want you to send this message to South Africa, that South Africa was instrumental to establish, the South African Jewish community was instrumental to establishing the State of Israel. And he wishes that all other communities, Jewish communities around the world, could be as impactful as the South African Jewish community. And if they were as impactful, we would have a much better world and a much better Israel. And I think that just marked for me, you see even today, the amazing, very proudly Zionist Jewish community that we have in South Africa, and to see its roots all the way back into 1948 and what an instrumental place they played in establishing the state. That's something that for me blew me away. And the other was a Siddur that we came across that was from this 1600s, early 1600s. And to be honest, before I worked here, I never even knew that the archive existed. And then to see the incredible things that are there, something dating back to the 1600s, and how the Siddur had handwritten before the printing press, is sitting in the archives of the SHABD in the tip of Africa. And also to see how it's the same exact prayers that we say today, and very much similar order, just shows the continuation and survival of the Jewish community and Jewish people in general. Over to you, David. What have some have been the best things that you found?
Of mine, well, obviously, it wasn't just that Siddur. There are a whole lot of beautifully handwritten manuscripts on cloth, on parchment, dating back even to the 1500s even. Yeah, so they were. I had no idea. These are the treasures that sort of came to light in our reorganization and of the archive, which is a whole story, which Adam maybe we'll have time to touch on it later. But Adam will bring it up. But for me, I used to work for Museum Africa before I came to the board, and it was a big South African history museum. It sort of rekindled my interest in the Anglo-Boer War. And then I learned about in the board archives. There's a big collection of documentation on Jews in the Anglo-Boer War, and particularly Jews who fought on the side of the Boers, and being very pro-Boer, So that was the first time I visited the archives to consult this part of the collection, and since then I've used it extensively. I mean, I've done many articles and a book, an exhibition. So I've got a lot of use out of that. And how that came into being was through Chief Rabbi Rabinovitz. He did the initial research. He was sort of a scholar on the side, a historian on the side, and he interviewed veterans, and he's got original correspondence from the veterans or their children or their descendants and so on. So that would be my favorite part of the archive.
And just to speak more on that, we have real artifacts from the Boer War. It includes a strange pair of leather pants that currently sit in my office, but also a scrapbook from a Jewish prisoner of war who was on Santa Lina.
Yeah. He was one of the very first. By the way, he one of the very first Jewish children to be born in Bloemfontein. One of the first children to be born in Bloemfontein in the 1850s, and he's from the Bauman family, and so that's just an additional point of interest.
So, it's really incredible to see them keeping pictures. They made little plays for each other to keep themselves occupied. So there's like playbills. Really quite an incredible artifact.
Yeah.
And Adam, I'd love you to talk of something else that I found incredibly moving, was how we have the minutes of different organizations' meetings, and one of them being obviously the SHABD, and the minutes that they have during the time of the Holocaust and what they call the Holocaust, etc. If Adam, you wouldn't mind talking on that.
So this is actually our boss Wendy's favorite artifact, but it's called the Special Committee on the Tragedy in Europe. So they don't yet call it the Holocaust because it's ongoing at the time.
And they don't know what's happening.
But you can read in the pages that they have an inclination of what's happening, and they really feel that they need to do something. And it's goosebump stuff when you read it, because they're sitting in the same kind of meetings as what we sit in at the board to discuss the strategy to move forward. And they know that this thing is happening. They estimate already that 2 million Jews have been killed. And they're discussing how to respond. And one of the interesting things is they talk about austerity measures, that there shouldn't be big bar mitzvahs and weddings while this tragedy is going on, and that's really quite phenomenal. And then the other side of that is that we have a lot of the soldiers' information and documentation, and the most heartbreaking probably is the box of letters that we have from people who are searching for their relatives. In most cases handwritten, in some cases even in Yiddish. And it's really quite heartbreaking. Gabi, you've seen all the newspapers. You've spoken about the designer's record. I must just... there's something special that happens in that you find all sorts of funny events that you open a box and there's suddenly somebody that you know or something like that. Today, David and I were having a laugh at a soccer contract from the Jewish Guild Soccer Club for George Best, which we didn't realize that George Best played a few games for Jewish Guild.
George Best, in case people don't know, he was like the British Pele, the British Maradona. I mean, he was like a soccer genius, real legend in his own lifetime.
And but what's quite funny is that the contract is made out to George West, and the W is crossed out with the PN. Unfortunately, the contract isn't signed, or probably we'd be able to pay for the whole renovation. But it's really quite an incredible document. Has there been any moment that you've come across something that you've seen, a relative or something that you found?
I haven't had a relative personally, but what has been incredible is to see. Often when we've had meetings at the board, we've brought people, members of the board, members outside of the board, just to come and see the stuff that we're going through, and to see how each person connects to the archive and finds something there that is connected, whether it be something that they bond with. And also something that also struck me was the amount of cases that we have on anti-Semitism, that the board we're taking cases to the court all the way back to the early 1900s.
Yeah, the first big court case was 1934, but before that there were they were taking legal measures to protect Jewish rights, but the first big court case against anti-Semitism was 1934, and we got a fortune of stuff on that.
That's particularly interesting.
That was the neo-Nazi grey shirts. It was a kind of a protocol of the Elder of Zion in a South African context. They tried to put off that kind of stunt.
Right, they said that they stole a document from a shul, right?
Yeah, in Port Elizabeth.
That proved that proves the protocols.
Yeah, they wrote they rehashed the protocols, signed it Reverend Abraham Levy, who was the rabbi in the shul at the time, and because it was defamation, they weren't sued for anti-Semitism because there weren't any laws against it, but they were sued for defamation of character by the rabbi there, and the board took the case on his behalf. And it was an important case because it was one of the international cases that proved the protocols of the Elder of Zion to be a forgery.
Sure, it's incredible, and it's incredible to see the actual documentation. I'll just quickly read an ad that...
This is Jewish Board Talk with Cherise Zeffert, only on 101.9 Chai FM.
Welcome back to Jewish Board Talk. This is Adam Charnas, joined by Gabi Farber Cohen, taking over today from Cherise Zeffert, who's away for the week. David, we've been speaking a lot about the archives, but one of the interesting things that we're noticing and that we're talking about is what's the future of the archives, and what kind of details and what kind of issues are we going to be looking at moving forward. So, for instance, one of the things I've noticed is that in the 60s I did microfilm, and before that there were vinyl records, and everybody kept trying to move away from paper, but paper's actually lasted since in some cases the 1600s.
That's such all these, remember the CDs obsolete. Remember the DVD. What do we call those things in that they put them into
tapes?
Videotapes. You remember video cassettes? This is from I'm giving from my days in the 90s. You just throw it out. I mean, what can you do with all this stuff? And as you say, it's only the paper that kind of lasts. But as we've discovered, there was too much paper. They collected everything.
Right.
And it's they subscribe to so many journals, international, local, general interest journals, and they just cut and filed and frankly, a great deal of that stuff is of no use to us anymore. So we've been pruning as well as streamlining it a bit. It's been a good exercise in that sense.
It's also interesting to think about how we communicate today versus how they communicated back then. Of course, in the early days they would write letters, and we have those written letters as correspondence. But today, things happen on WhatsApp, things happen on email, and we don't necessarily keep the paper.
Yes, there's going to be if anybody wants to research what we've been doing the last 20 years, there are going to be huge gaps. Most of that information is no longer accessible. Because it's not. You don't have librarians, digital librarians, working in this area anymore. It's going to hit hard. In the future, it's waiting.
It's a very interesting challenge for us in terms of how we move the archives and archival practices forward. Gabi, you've been speaking a lot about what the next, if we continue the archives, which of course we're doing, but what that next 20 years are going to look like and what kind of information is going to be kept over the next 20 years.
So, as I was saying, that for me, it's quite fascinating to see, and it's very sad, the amount of of boxes and files that we have on anti-Semitism. And just yesterday, a few weeks ago actually, I came across a box that said anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I really do feel that our, so to say, contribution to the archive of the next era will be this linkage between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It was always something that was very grey and controversial to say, but I think after October 7th, we really saw these two subjects crossing paths greatly, and to some extent people hiding their anti-Semitism behind the walls of anti-Zionism, saying, I have no problem with Jews, but I have a problem with Zionists. And specifically to the community of South Africa, we know, according to the survey done by Adam Mendelson at UCT, that a majority of our community identify themselves as Zionists.
Huge minority.
The Jewish community. And above that, majority of the community have an attachment towards Israel. So to say I don't have a problem with Jews, I have a problem with Zionists, it's a bit ridiculous because they're the same person. And I went to this interfaith conference, and they made a comment: what part of your identity brought you into the room, and which part of your identity did you have to leave at the door to be in the room? And we're seeing more and more people are coming into the board asking for help on how to deal with this, because people are saying, we don't have a problem with you as a Jew, but you can't say anything about Israel and Zionism, and getting attacked on that basis. And I think, David, as an expert in anti-Semitism, how do you see the link between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? Where do they cross over and where do they not?
Yeah, look, this is the most difficult, complex issue that the entire Jewish world is grappling with and has to. And the problem is you have to judge it on a case-by-case basis, because to some extent it is valid to criticize, to be critical of Israel, even if the criticism happens to be unfair, so long as it's not motivated by prejudice. So often, as we know, the kind of, when anti-Zionism takes an extreme, exaggerated form, you can at least suspect anti-Semitism, but sometimes it's a kind of political correctness. You have to judge it on a case-by-case basis. That's why it's so complicated. There are many nuances to it.
If I can just interject here, David, there are, however, some formulations that we can use.
Yes, the 3Ds.
3Ds is one, which is dehumanizing, demonizing, and double standards, which is to say that
delegitimization.
The fourth D, which is just,
I've come up with a couple of others as well, but defamation,
which is to say that if criticism of Israel crosses that line, so that it dehumanizes the person you're criticizing or demonizes, or applies a double standards, then you can look at it as becoming anti-Semitic. There's also something that I see quite often is the using of anti-Jewish tropes to describe a Zionist or to describe Israel, which is also a form of anti-Semitism, and a clear case that what you're talking about in this particular instance isn't just anti-Zionism, it's actually becoming anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Sometimes when people use the Zionists as a code word for Jews, and they talk about the Zionists control the media, that all the old tropes, and then that's fairly easy to identify. Yeah.
Would you say that?
Oh, by the way, one big problem we have is, of course, the Jewish anti-Zionists, who are being used as a kind of a front. They're a fringe, but they're a very noisy fringe, and they are become a kind of alibi Jews, which enables people hostile, anti-Semites, basically, to attack the rest of the great majority of Jews, and under the guise of just attacking ideology, not a people.
And I think for me, what bothers me is not necessarily that they're fringe, but that people use them, and they use a fringe to discredit the majority.
Yes.
And for me, that's the problem, one. And two is that the only time they call out that they're Jewish is when they're denouncing Israel. And then, how Jewish are you? If the only time you're saying I'm Jewish is to attack Jews. But a question that often I think people go to the board and ask, and we have to explain to people, would you say that for someone to shout Free Palestine is anti-Semitic?
Absolutely not. But if he shouts Free Palestine at a Jewish person walking the street, then it is. Because then he's holding a Jewish person, collective responsibility. Right. Your people are doing this, and I'm going for you. It's an act of hostility and intimidation against a Jewish person.
That's actually quite an interesting point, because oftentimes we see graffiti, for instance, which affects everybody that drives past and makes them feel uncomfortable. But technically, it's not anti-Semitic to write Free Palestine on a wall. It's maybe illegal, but it's not anti-Semitic.
Yeah, if you write on a shul wall,
then it's becoming anti-Semitic.
Then it is,
Flying a Palestinian flag in your car is not anti-Semitic, but if you're driving through Glen Hazel,
deliberately in order
antagonistically, yes.
And I think it's very important for the community to understand this, because we can't call everything anti-Semitic, because then it dulls down the wall. And some people get, I think, frustrated at the Jewish Board of Deputies, because they'll phone in and say this and this, someone screamed anti-Free Palestine, and we have to sometimes say the hard truth. I'm really sorry, but that's, in that specific circumstance, that's not anti-Semitic.
Sure, there's a big difference between what makes us feel uncomfortable and what's actually anti-Semitic. And that's, unfortunately, that space exists, and it's very difficult also, because oftentimes we know in our hearts what we're experiencing, and Jews are often told to explain why they're experiencing something. We often say at the board, we're the only racial group that has to, or not even racial group, we're the only religious group or cultural group that has to constantly say why something's offensive to them.
Yeah, and to be accused of lying about it because we have ulterior motives. We've heard that script before.
I mean, we're currently hearing that script in the Adam Mendelsohn case with UCT.
We are, and that's actually quite an interesting case that's bringing up a lot of interesting questions about Zionism and race and anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and religion, which is actually where our next guest, Rabbi Warren Sher, is going to speak on a little bit. But just to move back a little bit to the anti-Semitism, David, we're seeing anti-Zionism as a very strong front and a very powerful sort of weapon against Jews.
Yeah.
is this something new, or is this something that we've seen in your experience working in anti-Semitism for?
Well, it's been intensifying, especially post-1994, of course, because one thing about the old South Africa, it was very pro-Zionist. It was the white regime they didn't like Jews very much necessarily. They were suspicious of Jews, largely because Jews produced so many, like anti-apartheid activists. That was a problem. But Israel was fine.
It wasn't a problem for our Jewish community, something we're very proud of, but was something that was a problem for
for the national
party.
For the regime. They didn't like. They had issues with Jews, not some issues, but pro-Israel. Then the ANC comes into power, and they've been in power for over 30 years, and they are the complete opposite. Completely down the line, PLO, pro-Palestinian, and Israel is the enemy. But it's been getting progressively worse, and this post-7 October, we're in a totally different space. It's now open hostility. They are actively pursuing the cause of those who are trying to destroy the Jewish, openly trying to seek to destroy the Jewish state.
And I think on that, for me, I personally am pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel. But where I found the problem with the ANC is that they were veering off being pro-Palestine and rather going to pro-Hamas. And that's where I had a personal problem. Because I think that you can, if you really want to be pro-peace, you have to be pro both people.
And that's definitely subject for a show that we have to do with Gabi Farber Cohen, former spokesperson of the ANC Women's League, because your personal journey is really fascinating. And
the betrayal.
Betrayal. And it also speaks to exactly that line that gets skirted between being pro-Palestine and being anti-Semitic, and where the line exists, and how you had to define for yourself, Gabi, where you saw them crossing that line.
Great.
So let's do a live read. Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, is a time to show appreciation and to thank people. If you want to send a special gift to someone in South Africa, the Selwyn Siegel gift shop has a wide range of beautiful gifts for all tastes across a wide range of prices, and they deliver nationwide. Visit their website, selwynsiegelgifts.co.za. That's selwynsiegelgifts.co.za. I know that we at the board have used Selwyn Siegel in the past. I know that my family uses Selwyn Siegel gift shop, and I encourage everybody to use them.
And truly, I went to Chevra Kadisha. We did a tour last night, and just to see the incredible work that they're doing. I know this isn't part of the ad, but it's important to highlight that in any way we can support our community, that's what will give our community the longevity it deserves.
Thank you.
This is Jewish Board Talk with Cherise Zeffert, only on 101.9 Chai FM.
Welcome to Board Talk. I am Gabi Farber Cohen, and I am with my colleague Adam Charnas, and we are taking over the show today from our colleague Cherise Zeffert, who is currently in Guakwani. We've been discussing our archives, the SAJBD archives, and just something to mention on that. We've said very interesting things, in my opinion, about the archives, and please God, we are going to do a relaunch of the archives, and we really encourage all participants of the community to come and see it, come and know our history as the South African Jewish community. For more information, look at our social media platforms of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. This is something very interesting that we get researchers coming probably nearly weekly to the archives to do research on the South African Jewish community and use the archive for their research. But we are currently on this interview, we just interviewed David Sachs on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and now we have a great friend of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, Rabbi Warren, and I think if we look at anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and its link, we have to actually go to its core. And what is that core? It's the link between Judaism and Zionism. And I know growing up for me, I actually never saw my Zionism as something political. Growing up at Yeshiva College, a religious Zionist school, going to B'nai Akiva, religious Zionist youth movement, my Zionism was intrinsically linked to my Judaism. And for me to say I'm a Zionist and for me to say I'm a Jew was one and the same. And therefore, when I started being attacked for my Zionism, and people would say, we don't have a problem with you as a Jew, we have a problem with you as a Zionist, I felt that was actually ridiculous to say, because for me it was the same thing. And Rabbi, I would actually like, well, many of us know that there is a link. Could you actually explain to us the link between Judaism and Zionism, and also the disconnect and where they separate between Zionism and Judaism, if they do, in your opinion?
Well, hi, thanks so much. It's great to be here. So I think the most important thing is to go back and to say, we go back to right back to the beginning. The first word that was ever said by God to man was to Abraham. It says, get up, leave your father's house and go to the land I'll show you. Go to the land of Israel. That was the first command. That was Judaism was about. Okay, whenever we left the land, all we were thinking about is getting back. The whole book of Exodus, of Shmot, was how we left Egypt and we moved towards the land. Bamidbar was about how we were supposed to go in the land and what happened and what delayed us. And then, the rest of the Tanakh, which is the book that my daughter and I, we just finished learning for her bat mitzvah.
Wow.
But it's all a story of the Jews and the land and the relationship. When we behave, we get the land. When we don't behave, we remove from the land. But it was, something that's completely enmeshed into Judaism. It's something that's completely connected. Let's talk, this is before the isms. And, I think all the isms was how Judaism dealt with modernity. Okay, but let's talk about what Judaism was. And Judaism was that it was about the people living in the land. If you go into the medieval times, you've got the book of the Kuzari. And this was the king of the Khazars had this dream about that, your thoughts are right, your actions are wrong, and he kind of was going around trying to find somebody who could explain the dream. And eventually he found a rabbi, and there's this whole discussion between him. And one of the questions he asks exactly this. He says, what's Judaism got to do with the land of Israel? I think it's quite interesting because, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, the author of the Kuzari, gives this mashal, gives this parable of the vineyard, and said that the vineyard you can plant anywhere and it will grow. And the land, you can put anything in it and it will also grow. But only when you take the vines and you place it in the right soil that is made for them, and you water them with the right water, which is the Torah. Only in that case will it really grow. And that, I think that's the mashal, that for the Jewish people to really flourish, we need to be us in our land, with our guidebook, the Torah. And that's the vision, that it's so connected. The truth was that I think after the destruction of the temple, it was, there was a great effort to be able to say that Judaism can survive without the land. Not to say it's meant to be that way, but how do we separate? How can we keep the calendar running without without witnesses arriving in Jerusalem to declare the new moon? How do we deal with the concept of a shul came at that point, saying, well, the Beit HaMikdash is gone, how are we going to gather, how are we going to pray? And all of this was kind of built because we couldn't have the land. But obviously that was the ideal of what Judaism was, is the Jewish people in the land.
And I think because we were in exile for so long, and we are the generation where we are part of the redemption, because we have the land of Israel now. We kind of forgot that the whole part of Judaism was the land. If you look at our different festivals, actually all are surrounded around the land of Israel. Of bringing the sacrifices, going up to the Shalosh Regalim, going up to the Beit HaMikdash, all of that we got so caught up on the religion outside of the land of Israel that we kind of thought that was the norm. And we now need, when you read these transcripts and you read the Tanakh, then it becomes so evident that it's not about living outside the land, it's about living within the land. But now we have a very interesting thing of the Haredi community, even some in South Africa. They have a very, very strong connection to Israel, but they won't necessarily call themselves Zionists. How come?
So, look, I think, this all goes back to modernity. The late 18th century, early 19th century, I listened to a great podcast called Jewish History Soundbites, and Yehuda Geber, who's the host, has this major thesis that actually, everybody, because as modernity hit and secularization happened, everybody and every stream in Judaism was trying to see, how do we save Judaism in this how do we stop assimilation? So whether it was, the reform, taking away the boundaries of halakha and, kind of working on, well, if it doesn't make sense to us, we can kind of, work with it. Or it was, let's say the Haredi or the Agudat Yisrael that really honed in and said, we're going to block modernity in its totality. Or, other people said, well, we need to bring the Jews back to the land. All people says we need to become secular, we need to become Yiddishist. Everyone was trying to see, how do we stop, the march of secularization? How do we bring that back? So, I think Judaism, anyone who believes in Torah Judaism, has a very strong connection to the land of Israel. There's a small fringe, a minority of 0.1% in Torah character, and things that believe Jews should not have Israel and we cannot have anything until the Messiah arrives. But everyone's got a very strong connection. The question is, do we see what has happened in the last 80 or 100 years as a process of redemption and God turning back to us and looking at us with favor, and we see God's hand in it? Or do we say that it is what it is, or do we look at the bad, do we look at the good? And I mean, as Judaism, we know that we don't believe in such thing as coincidence. From a hashkafic perspective, from a thought perspective, it's for us, everything is, purpose. That everything happens for a reason. It's one of the core fundamentals of the Jewish religion. So with that, also going back to the Haredi situation is what also I think is fascinating is we've had even Haredi people from South Africa send in complaints to the SAJBD, where people are calling them Zionists, and in an antagonistic, discriminatory way. And in that situation, they do identify themselves as Zionists. And I just found that fascinating, which, when they're being attacked for Zionism, they'll very much stand proud, and be like, do not attack me on my Zionism. What do you think of that? I'm saying, I think the reality is, the South African Jewish community, I would say, is putting themselves, that almost everyone fits into the Zionist camp.
Agreed.
Whether they're pro-army or they love the state and they can deal with the secular nature of the state is not, but they all see Israel as something important and realize that having Israel is critical for the survival of the Jewish people, even if we're not living there yet. I don't think we have the hardline Haredi in South Africa.
Yeah, completely. And now for an ad break.
This is Jewish Board Talk with Cherise Zeffert, only on 101.9 Chai FM.
Welcome back to Jewish Board Talk. I'm Adam Charnas. I'm joined today by Farber Cohen. We're taking over from Cherise. Rabbi, you were telling us in the ad break about a fantastic sentence that really puts everything into context.
So I once sat in a shir, and Rabbi Cohen from the Gush once said, he says, he gets a person, you can get a person who goes through Yom Ha'atzmaut and sees the miracles that God, sees what happened and the Jews getting their land back in the 6-day war, and think that these things are, the work of the Satan, and they're terrible, and they, are way down the toilet. Or you can see it the work of God, and God remembering us, God remembering us and coming back to us, and, having us back in our own land. But it says you just cannot understand any person who just can see these events and see that nothing happened. That it's the same day as yesterday. How can that be? How can you be so tone deaf to history?
That's really true, and I think what you were talking about earlier about the marriage of modernity and the religion is in essence the problem with Zionism as a Jewish concept. One of the things that we see in the press quite often is the idea that the Jews of the Bible are not the Israelites of today, or the Israelites of the Bible are not connected to Israel today. Do you have a thought on this? Can you speak on that?
So look, I think at the time, and if you're a student of history, there were many different sects of Judaism around the time, and many people fighting. We talk about the stories of the destruction of the different camps inside Jerusalem, those who wanted to burn down the food so everyone would fight, and those who wanted to appease, and those who believed only in the written Torah, those believed the written and the oral Torah. There's a very strong connection between what we call rabbinic Judaism from, the year of the destruction. It could be people can trace the lineage all the way. This is the same tradition that we've held, same books we've learned, same tradition, the same discussions we've had is with the people 2,000 years ago. When you sit in the Beit Midrash, you're discussing what people said 2,000 years ago, and you're having the discussions, you're trying to get into their heads what they were discussing. This is exactly what's been going on for 2,000 years. So, okay, sometimes we become a little bit, living in Galut. When we started codifying the halakha, you had, the Rambam who said, well, I have to write on everything. So you had the Mishnah, which was on all 6 books. Then the Gemara and the Yerushalmi, because it was coming out of the land of Israel, had a lot more focus on the mitzvot in the land of Israel. Suddenly the Bavli, coming from Babylonia, was written, and there was, more scant on. Some of the books were written, the parts on those things were in other books, but they didn't make a major focus on that. When we started codifying the law, the Rambam and the Rif codified everything, brought down all the halakha across the full gamut of whether it was agricultural law, whether it was military law, how to be a Jewish soldier. Rambam codifies everything because that is where it is. The Tur went and said, no, let's go. We just wrote 4 books. Instead of the Rambam 14 books, he wrote 4 books and said, what's practical today? Let's talk about our daily life. Let's talk about in daily life, the cycle. Then let's talk about what is allowed and forbidden, how kosher and not kosher, and allowed and forbidden. Well, let's talk about business law. Let's talk about marriage and divorce. That's what's happening today. But all these things about Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and all what's going on in the land of Israel, all the things and how to run a government and how to run an army was not really spoken about. And suddenly we had to go back to books. And the fascinating thing, when you start seeing halakha, people are starting to bring down halakha of Shemitah straight from the Rambam because no one else has written on it for 1,500 years. And starting to now going back, and now we're starting the discourse on things we hadn't really dealt with in so many years. And there's no doubt that it's an unbroken tradition for the last 2,000 years back to the people, the rabbis of the Mishnah.
So in some ways that sort of links us back to our earlier conversation on the archives, because one of the books we have is a Rambam written on parchment, obviously copied onto parchment in handwriting from the 1500s. So it's a great link back, I suppose, to our earlier conversation, but it does also speak to that unbroken chain.
Yeah.
Great. And I just think to close off what we've discussed and to sum up, we started off with the archives and what our archives have, and then we went into the archives talk a lot on anti-Semitism and how now we have currently seen that our new, so to say, era of anti-Semitism has found its place in being hidden by anti-Zionism. And then we were really so appreciative to have our guest, Dr. a doctor in Torah, Rabbi Warren, explaining to us the intrinsic, unbreakable link between Judaism and Zionism. And just, I think it's really a closing circle, because the Jewish history has been transcribed in the Torah, in the Rambam, in the Gemorahs, and even something so small as the archives of the SAJBD. Thank you so much today for listening to us. Engage with us. Follow us on our social media platforms on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and send us any questions you have on this podcast. Shabbat Shalom to all, and looking forward to hearing you next week.